Before we continue, let it be known there will be mentions and depictions of gruesome imagery and topics. For those who can't handle that sort of thing, I'd advise you to turn back, but if you're just as morbidly curious as I am, well then.
We have such sights to show you.
For those who haven't gotten around to playing the series, I'd say to start with Corpse Party 2021. It's available on Steam, PS4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch. For the rest of the catalog, it's all available on Steam individually, and a bundle at a discount. With that out of the way, let's talk about Corpse Party. I've been trying to make this video at this point for 2 years. Hopefully it comes out the way I initially envisioned it. Everyone found different ways to get through 2020. For me, it was my family and friends, and a computer I bought off of Superchote. It was a welcomed purchase because I was bit by the nostalgia bug a few months after I quit my job in the previous year. With that PC, I rediscovered a lot of horror games from my youth, and after playing my first RPG Maker game, called Angels of Death, I got interested in the subgenre of RPG Maker games. I ended up discovering the series in question, Corpse Party, because I had seen Pewdiepie play it years ago. When I tried to play the version that was available on Steam at the time, the Corpse Party 2008, I found it lacking, and not quite right compared to what I remember from the Pewdiepie video. I rewatched the playthrough he did in order for me to get an understanding of what version he was playing, and after doing some research I found out that he was playing the PSP version, called Corpse Party Blood Covered Repeated Fear, on an emulator. I got a hold of it, played it, and I was absolutely intrigued by the series from there. I moved on to the other titles available on Steam and completed the series. Well, except Blood Drive, but we'll get into that. I'm not going to be talking about the manga, because I didn't read it whenever it is that I played the series in 2020, and I'm not going to be talking about Dead Patient either, since it isn't canon to the original story. It's kind of its own separate thing. If you'd be interested in learning about the franchise that helped me get through the pandemic, and a franchise I'd recommend to any fans of darker anime like Future Diary or Higurashi, then let's begin. Corpse Party 2008 and the other iterations such as Corpse Party Blood Covered Repeated Fear are RPG Maker games with visual novel elements. Most of the game is played in the RPG Maker style, while the dialogue and cutscenes are similar to that of a visual novel. It has multiple endings in each chapter, as well as for the game itself. The game focuses on a group of 9 characters who find themselves stuck in a nightmarish version of a place called Heavenly House Elementary. Once inside the school, they come to find that they're all separated from one another in their own dimension, where time is convoluted, and there is no normal means of escape. As the characters begin to explore, they uncover a grisly truth involving the mutilation and murder of school children, as well as other atrocities that happened at the original version of the school and the current version that they find themselves in. Through exploration and interacting with spirits of those who passed, the characters eventually learn that the only way to escape is to uncover the true murderer of the first children who were killed. The music, voice acting, CG scenes, and even the low-poly sprites, which leave a lot to the imagination, all help to build Heavenly House Elementary to be a truly nightmarish hell, where spending even a minute can feel like eternity. One last thing to note: should you die at Heavenly House Elementary, not only will your spirit be trapped there, but you will feel the pain of death for all eternity. And your spirit is free to be used as a toy by the murderer of those children. This is a good introduction to the Corpse Party franchise, and being that I played it during a very scary time in the world, the horror of being trapped with limited supplies, scared of what others might do in desperation, was all too real at times. After playing this game, I was hooked. The next game was what really made me fall in love with the series, though, and that's what we're going to move on to. Rather than being an RPG Maker game with visual novel elements, Book of Shadows is a visual novel with RPG Maker elements. Book of Shadows doesn't have a coherent story told through its chapters. Rather, some chapters are the same events from the first game in a separate timeline, while other chapters are a prequel to the events of the first game. The chapters in the separate timeline act as a what-if scenario, where the game continued after receiving a bad ending in the first game. The first chapter will clue you in as to what ending I'm talking about. So, it isn't technically necessary to continue the series, but it still has value for those who love Corpse Party, as a companion piece to the first game. This is due to some characters having an actual story in this game, as opposed to what happened to them in the first game, or, in the case of Mayu, what happened to her in the later games. Mayu and Miss Yui from the first game have their own chapters, which not only fleshes them out as characters, but also allows us to get to know them as we play through their chapters. From the first chapter all the way to the last chapter, the overall tone and reality of the situations the characters are going through feel a lot more intense compared to the first game. Most likely, this is due to the change in perspective. Most of the game takes place from a quasi-first-person view, so instead of a sprite being affected that's separate from the player, it feels as though the player themselves is being affected through the character. This of course leads to walking through the hallways of Heavenly Host or receiving a wrong end much more visceral than the previous entry. While the previous entry did have a health system that was used occasionally, this game features something called a darkening level, which accumulates as a player chooses to examine corpses or receives damage from spirits or the environment. The darkening, for those who are unfamiliar, was essentially the influence of Heavenly Host Elementary. It'd be comparable to madness or hopelessness. Depending on the person, being affected by the darkening would sometimes cause them to act like rage zombies in 28 Days Later, or like the Infected in the Crossed series. Once the player receives a 100% darkening level, a death scene unique to whichever character you have to be playing as is shown. And the best part about this game is that it autosaves before the player makes a choice, which allows you to go right back to the decision screen after receiving a wrong end. This allows you to imbibe in your morbid curiosity to see how badly these characters can be affected, or tortured, or killed. Corpse Party Book of Shadows is an excellent companion piece to the original game. Seeing some of the grisly ends to some of the characters, or seeing some alternative ends for characters from a more visceral, up-close perspective solidifies the death and hopelessness of Heavenly Host Elementary. In fact, it was because of this game that I got even further engrossed in the series, and my opinions on the characters were even further solidified. Before we move on to the only game in the series I didn't like, let's talk about the anime. Corpse Party Tormented Souls is a 4-episode anime adaptation of the original game, made by the same company who made the game. It follows the original 9 characters just as the game did, but with a different take on some of the quasi-established rules. It features an original ending, and much like School Days, decides to reimagine the worst possible fates for the characters involved. The character design and voice cast are exactly the same as the games. Being able to see an animated version of what I experienced in the first 2 games allowed me to even more viscerally experience what I felt in Book of Shadows. It kind of clarifies what things were happening at the same time in the first game, since the first game kind of just makes it seem like some characters are doing stuff and others were just sitting there crying or forgetting that they exist. Personally, I thought that the change to how certain characters die and how they're portrayed was a bit annoying, but I did really like some characters and have an extreme hatred for others when I was playing the game, so maybe it's just me. I think it's a good watching experience, especially with a friend who's into horror. I don't know if it'd be a good entry point to the series, but if you kind of want to see how things are portrayed after playing the game, I think it would be something good to experience. It was available on High Dive, as well as a live-action movie, but the only way to kind of watch it now is, well, if you search things up on YouTube, you might be able to find more content to satisfy your craving for wanting to watch this particular series. Anyway, finally, we move on to the only game I never finished and don't fully recommend unless you really want to know what happens in the series. If you want to see what happens to the characters following the events of the first game, it is technically how it ends and the true ending for those characters, but I think that you can have a pretty good experience just playing the first game and maybe Book of Shadows, or if you can't play Book of Shadows, then watching the anime after, and I think you'll be satisfied overall. Rather than an RPG Maker aesthetic, this game is done using the Unity engine. It still maintains the same camera angles as the original game, as well as the stature of the characters from the original game, and what that does is it basically makes the characters look like Animal Crossing characters, which I'm sure some would find creepy or disturbing, but to me, I just found it fucking hilarious.
Give your meat a good old rub. Yeah, boy.
The darkening status effect does come back, but there's not an easily tangible way to check how badly you're affected by it. The health meter is also back, and there are more things to drain it this time around. Evil spirits now chase you throughout the school, and only a talisman can stop them. Well, it is possible to hide from them, but the mechanic is so fucked that it might as well just not exist. The spirits either wait right around the corner from your hiding place and never move far enough away to safely evade them, or they stay right behind you when you're trying to hide so that they can kick you the fuck out of the hiding place and get 2 free hits. Aside from that, the school has gotten more unstable since our last visit, and the pulley system that you used in the first game is now just kind of bare, and what was being used was like razor sharp string. So whenever it's just exposed and you're walking around, that shit just fucks you up and you lose a shitload of health. But it's not just the string though, there's also broken glass and loose floorboard, all kinds of shit that fucks you up and slowly kills you, on top of the spirits and on top of everything else. And the most frustrating thing is that regardless of the brightness settings you have, you need to use your flashlight, otherwise you're not going to see any of this shit. So it's obviously very important, but the problem is, at the start of the game, if you don't mess with any of the settings, you need batteries, because of course you do. And the funny thing is, there's an option to turn this off. So the question has to be asked, why the fuck would you have a flashlight that needs batteries if you know that the vast majority of players, after playing with it for like 10 minutes, is just going to turn it off? Like, the fuck? Anyway, all of these things, combined with way more chase sequences similar to the RE4 scene where Leon is running away from the boulder, and the time-based escape the water sequences in the last chapter of the first game, are the reasons I haven't finished this game yet. It goes. This game also introduces some new characters, and their design is by far the most like anime as fuck shit I have ever seen. I mean, obviously it is an anime, but there was like a level of realism to the other characters. The only character that kind of seemed out of place was Sachiko, but outside of her design, everybody else kind of fits. Like, they look realistic, but no. One character looks like a fucking hentai princess, or like a character from fucking Bible Black. The other character looks like a Sora concept art. And it's just evil for the sake of being evil, because of fucking course he is. They introduce, like, Sachiko's sister, or some shit. Like, I would need to replay the game to actually fully tell you other things I don't know. And eventually, I will, but let's just conclude this shit, because I'm getting tired of talking about this game. I hope this gives everyone a brief look into the Corpse Party series, especially if you're interested in checking it out and don't know where to start. I will make a short video series talking about each game in detail if people are interested in that, and if you are, just go ahead and leave a comment. I wouldn't say that it's as intense as other series I've watched, such as Higurashi or the Cross series or School Days. I think Future Diary in some ways is a bit more bloody than this one, but it's the subtlety about this game that really engrossed me, that really got me. I think it's worth checking out. The virus outbreak, the C virus, affected me on a very deep emotional and mental level, and this game was a welcome distraction from all of that. Being how much passion I felt during the pandemic, or the start of the pandemic, it was nice to find an outlet to kind of express myself and see something. Basically, knowing that things can be so much worse somehow made things feel better for me. So if you did watch this video, I'm glad you watched it. If you liked this video, go ahead and leave a like. And if you're interested in seeing more anime content or Corpse Party content, I suggest you subscribe. Thank you for listening to me ramble.